Blood and Redemption, A Tale of Azeroth. Chapter 1, The Unlikely Meeting. The acrid smoke of battle hung heavy over Dustwallow Marsh as Thok Bloodfist pressed his massive frame against the overturned wagon, his weathered axe dripping with Alliance blood. The supply convoy he'd been tasked to protect lay scattered across the muddy battlefield, crates of grain and medical supplies trampled beneath the hooves of warhorses and the boots of human soldiers. "Hold the line!" Thok bellowed to his fellow orcs, his voice cutting through the clash of steel and the screams of the dying. At 43 winters, the grizzled warrior had seen more battles than most, and the scars crisscrossing his green skin told stories of countless victories. But today felt different. Today, the weight of past failures pressed down on him like a stone upon his chest. The Alliance had caught them in a perfect ambush. What should have been a routine supply run had become a massacre, and Thok's small band of Warsong warriors was dwindling rapidly. A crossbow bolt whistled past his ear, and he ducked instinctively, the fletching brushing against his black braided hair. "Thok!" Grak, his youngest warrior, called out from behind a fallen tree. "They're flanking us from the east." The orc commander's tusks gleamed as he snarled. He'd led these warriors into this trap through his own overconfidence, and now they would pay the price for his arrogance. The familiar taste of shame, bitter as wormwood, filled his mouth. Not again. He couldn't let his warriors die because of his mistakes again. "Fall back to the tree lean," he roared, hefting his great axe. "I'll buy you time." With a war cry that echoed across the marsh, Thok charged into the advancing Alliance soldiers. His axe sang through the air, cleaving through armor and bone alike. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide might turn. But then the crossbow bolt found its mark. The iron tip punched through a gap in his mail, sliding between his ribs with a wet sound that seemed to echo in his ears. Thok stumbled, his vision blurring as warmth spread across his chest. Another bolt took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The world tilted, and he found himself on his knees in the mud, watching his life's blood pool beneath him. Through the haze of pain, he saw his warriors retreating into the mist, carrying their wounded with them. Good. At least they would live. Perhaps that was enough to balance the scales of his honor, if only slightly. The Alliance soldiers approached cautiously, their weapons ready. But before they could deliver the killing blow, a voice cut through the air, melodious and commanding, speaking in accented common. "Stop. This one yet lives, and I claim right of salvage under the Dalaran Accords." Through dimming vision, Thok saw a figure emerge from behind the enemy lines. Tall and graceful, with flowing golden hair and the distinctive pointed ears of the Sindorii, she moved with purpose toward him. Her robes were stained with blood, not her own, but that of the wounded she had been tending. A blood elf priest, one of the Horde's newest allies. Lyralii, one of the human soldiers protested, "He's just an orc. Leave him to die with the rest." The blood elf's emerald eyes flashed with anger. "Captain Morrison, I am a sanctioned healer operating under Stormwind's own medical exemption treaties. This warrior is now under my protection." Thok tried to speak, to tell her not to waste her efforts on a failure like him, but only blood bubbled from his lips. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision as delicate hands pressed against his wounds, and he felt the familiar tingle of healing magic washing over him. "Why?" he managed to whisper before unconsciousness claimed him. The last thing he heard was her voice, soft but determined. "Because every life has value, warrior. Even yours." Chapter 2, Forced Alliance. Consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by the throbbing pain of healing wounds and the unfamiliar scent of silvermoon incense. Thok's eyes opened to find himself lying on a bedroll inside a small canvas tent, his chest wrapped in clean bandages. Magical light flickered from crystals suspended overhead, casting everything in an ethereal blue glow. "You're awake." The voice belonged to the blood elf who had saved him. She sat cross-legged nearby, her robes replaced by more practical traveling gear. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her usually perfect hair hung loose around her shoulders. "How do you feel?" Thok tested his limbs, surprised to find them functional. The wounds that should have killed him were reduced to dull aches. Like I've been trampled by a kodo, he growled, struggling to sit up. Why did you save me, Sindorii? Lyralii, she corrected, not looking up from the herbs she was grinding with a mortar and pestle. Lyralii Dawn whisper. And I saved you because it was the right thing to do. Right thing? Thok's laugh was bitter. I'm a warrior of the Horde. Your people have been our allies for barely 2 years. Most of the Alliance still considers us monsters. Most of the Alliance considers me a monster too, Lyralii replied quietly. They remember Kael'Thas's betrayal, our addiction to magic, our alliance with Illidan. Trust is a luxury neither of our peoples can afford. Thok studied her more carefully. Beneath the composed exterior, he could see the telltale signs of magical withdrawal, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes occasionally flicked to the mana crystals overhead with barely concealed hunger. Blood elves needed magic like orcs needed air, and she was clearly struggling. Where are the others? He asked. Gone. Both sides retreated after the battle. I was left behind to tend the wounded. She gestured to the tent flaps. We're alone out here. The implications hit him immediately. A blood elf healer and a wounded orc warrior, stranded in hostile territory with alliance patrols still in the area. Neither of them could survive alone. How long? He asked. 3 days. Your wounds were extensive. I've used most of my mana keeping you alive. She set down her mortar and looked at him directly. I need to reach Brackenwall village. The Horde outpost there can provide us both with what we need. Us? Thok raised an eyebrow. You need continued healing, and I need protection. The nearest Alliance settlement is Theramore, but I'd rather not test Lady Proudmoore's hospitality toward blood elves traveling alone. Thok considered this. The logical thing would be to thank her and part ways, but he could see the exhaustion in her bearing, the way she favored her left leg when she moved. She'd been injured too, probably while treating the wounded during the battle. I am Thok Bloodfist of the Warsong clan, he said formally. I am in your debt, healer. Lyralii, she repeated. And we're in each other's debt. I suggest we focus on staying alive long enough to repay it. A sound outside the tent made them both freeze, the jingle of mail and the soft splash of boots in marsh water. Lyralii's eyes widened as she mouthed, Alliance patrol. Thok moved despite his wounds, grabbing his axe from beside the bedroll. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, but familiar. 3 days of healing had helped, but he was still far from full strength. Can you walk? He whispered. I'll have to, she replied, already beginning to pack her medical supplies with practiced efficiency. The voices outside grew closer, and Thok could make out fragments of common speech, saw smoke from a fire. Check the area. Lyralii finished packing and slung her bag over her shoulder. There's a back way out, she whispered, pointing to a slit she'd apparently cut in the rear of the tent. The marsh is thick with reeds about 50 yards east. We can lose them there. Thok nodded, impressed despite himself. The blood elf had clearly thought this through. As they prepared to slip out into the night, he found himself wondering what other surprises this unlikely alliance might bring. The first step toward the tree-lean sent bolts of pain through his wounded chest, but Thok gritted his teeth and kept moving. Behind him, he could hear Lyralii's soft footsteps and the whispered incantations of spells to mask their passage. For the first time in days, the old warrior allowed himself a grim smile. Perhaps this strange partnership might actually work. Chapter 3, The Journey Begins. The pre-dawn mist clung to the marsh like a shroud as Thok and Lyralii picked their way through the treacherous terrain. They had been walking for 2 hours since escaping the Alliance patrol, and the orc could feel his strength waning with each step. The blood elf moved behind him with surprising grace, her light footsteps barely disturbing the muddy ground. We should rest, Lyralii said softly, noting how Thok's breathing had become labored. Your wounds need more time to heal. I'm fine, Thok growled, but even as he spoke, he stumbled on a root hidden beneath the murky water. Only Lyraliai's quick reflexes saved him from falling face first into the marsh. Her slender hands were surprisingly strong as she helped steady him. You're reopening the wound in your chest, she observed, her healer's training evident in her assessment. Sit. Now. Something in her tone brooked no argument, and Thok found himself obeying despite his instincts. He lowered himself onto a fallen log, wincing as fresh pain lanced through his ribs. Lyraliai knelt beside him, her hands beginning to glow with soft golden light. Remove your mail, she instructed. I need to see the damage. Thok hesitated. In Orcish culture, showing weakness was tantamount to inviting death. But as another wave of pain washed over him, he reluctantly complied. The bandages beneath were stained with fresh blood. Stubborn fool, Lyraliai muttered, but there was no malice in her voice. Her healing magic flowed into him, and Thok felt the familiar warmth spreading through his chest. Tell me about your clan. Why? Thok asked, surprised by the question. Because talking will keep you from dwelling on the pain, she replied practically. And because if we're going to travel together, we might as well know something about each other. Thok considered this. The Warsong clan values strength above all else. We are warriors born, riders of wolves, conquerors of enemies. He paused, his voice growing quieter. I have failed to live up to those ideals. How so? The question hit deeper than any blade. Thok was quiet for a long moment, watching the mist swirl around them. 5 years ago, I led a raid against a human settlement. I was young, arrogant, eager to prove myself. I ignored the warnings of my scouts, pushed forward when I should have retreated. His hands clenched into fists. 37 orcs died because of my pride. Good warriors, with families, with futures. Lyraliai's healing magic never wavered, but her expression grew thoughtful. And you've been trying to atone ever since. Honor, once lost, is not easily regained, Thok replied. Every battle since then has been an attempt to balance the scales. But the dead do not forgive, and the living do not forget. The living also don't expect perfection, Lyraliai observed. Even from their leaders. Thok looked at her sharply. You sound as though you speak from experience. It was Lyraliai's turn to be quiet. Her healing magic flickered slightly, and Thok noticed her hands trembling. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. My people fled to Outland after the Scourge destroyed our homeland, she said finally. When we returned and joined the Horde, there were expectations. The Sindorii were to be the perfect allies, refined, magical, useful. We were to prove that we belonged among the Horde's ranks. And you felt the weight of those expectations? I am the daughter of a magister, Lyraliai continued. My family expected me to follow in his footsteps, to master the arcane arts and bring honor to our house. But I felt called to healing instead. Do you know what it's like to disappoint those you love most? Thok nodded slowly. I know. My father called it a waste of my talents. Said that any troll witch doctor could heal wounds, but only a true Sindorii could master the complexities of advanced magic. Her voice grew bitter. He was ashamed of me. Yet you saved my life, Thok pointed out. And likely many others. Yes, but at what cost? I've been cut off from my people for months now, serving as a field medic for mixed units. I barely have enough mana to maintain my spells, and every day I feel the hunger growing stronger. She gestured to the mana crystals in her pouch. Soon, even these won't be enough. Thok felt a strange kinship with this blood elf. Both of them were outcasts in their own way, carrying burdens that others couldn't fully understand. Your father was wrong, he said simply. Lyraliai looked up at him, surprised. What? Any orc can swing an axe, Thok continued. But it takes true strength to choose healing over destruction, to preserve life instead of taking it. Your father was wrong. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The healing magic completed its work, and Lyralii sat back on her heels, looking exhausted but satisfied. The bleeding has stopped, she announced. But you'll need to take it easy for at least another day. We don't have a day, Thok reminded her. Those Alliance soldiers will be looking for us, and there may be more patrols. Then we'd better get moving, Lyralii agreed, shouldering her pack. Brackenwall village is still 2 days' march from here. As they prepared to continue their journey, Thok found himself looking at his unlikely companion with new respect. Perhaps honor could be found in unexpected places, and perhaps redemption was not always a solitary path. The marsh stretched endlessly before them, filled with dangers both known and unknown. But for the first time in years, Thok felt he wasn't facing those dangers alone. Chapter 4, Shared Burdens. By midday, the sun had burned away most of the morning mist, leaving them exposed on the open marsh. Thok's wounds had begun to ache again, but he pressed on without complaint. Lyralii walked beside him now rather than behind, her keen eyes scanning the horizon for signs of danger. There, she said, pointing to a cluster of twisted trees on a small rise. We can rest in the shade and get a better view of our surroundings. Thok nodded, grateful for the respite. As they climbed the gentle slope, he noticed Lyralii favoring her left leg more noticeably. You're injured, he observed. It's nothing, she replied, but the slight wince as she stepped over a fallen branch betrayed her. They settled beneath the largest tree, its gnarled branches providing welcome relief from the sun's heat. Lyralii began unpacking some dried rations while Thok kept watch. The marsh spread out below them like a vast, soggy carpet, broken only by patches of standing water and the occasional corpse of trees. Show me your leg, Thok said without looking at her. I told you, it's nothing. And I told you about my failures, he interrupted, turning to face her. We're partners now, whether we like it or not. I can't protect you if you're hiding injuries. Lyralii sighed and rolled up her pant leg, revealing a deep gash along her calf. The wound was several days old and had been roughly bandaged, but it was clearly infected. Angry red lines stretched up and down from the injury. Blood and thunder, Thok cursed. Why didn't you tend to this properly? Because I was too busy keeping you alive, she snapped, then immediately looked contrite. I'm sorry. It's been difficult. Thok studied the wound with the practical eye of a warrior who'd seen plenty of battlefield injuries. This needs cleaning and proper healing. Now. I can't, Lyralii said quietly. I've used too much mana already. My reserves are nearly empty. Then don't use magic, Thok replied. He reached into his own pack and withdrew a small leather pouch. My grandmother was a shaman. She taught me the old ways before I took up the axe. Lyralii watched with interest as Thok began pulling various herbs and supplies from his pouch. You know healing. Not like you, he admitted, crushing dried leaves between his palms. But enough field medicine to keep warriors alive until proper help arrives. He looked up at her. This will hurt. I'm not afraid of pain, Lyralii said, though she tensed as Thok began cleaning the wound with water and the herbal mixture. Tell me about Silvermoon, Thok said, echoing her earlier tactic of using conversation to distract from discomfort. I've heard it's beautiful. Lyralii's eyes grew distant. It was. Before the Scourge, it was the most magnificent city in all of Azeroth. Spires of crystal and gold reaching toward the sky, fountains that sang with magical energy, gardens where the very air shimmered with power. She winced as Thok applied more pressure to the wound. The Sunwell was the heart of it all. Pure, endless magic that sustained our entire civilization. And now? Now half the city lies in ruins. The Sunwell is gone, replaced by a fell crystal that feeds our addiction but slowly poisons our souls. We've learned to drain magic from other sources, but it's never enough. Never clean. Her voice broke slightly. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better to die with dignity than to live like this. Thok's hand stilled. You don't mean that. Don't I? Lyralii laughed bitterly. Look at me, Thok. I'm a healer who can barely heal herself. A daughter who brings shame to her family. A Sindorii who can barely control her hunger for magic. What purpose do I serve? You saved my life, Thok said firmly. You're keeping us both alive out here. You chose compassion over convenience, healing over destruction. That has to count for something. Does it? When my people are dying, when my father won't even speak to me, when I'm so desperate for mana that I dream about it at night. Tears began to flow down her cheeks. I left Silvermoon to prove I could make a difference. Instead, I've proven I'm just another broken Sindorii, dependent on magic and unworthy of the sacrifices made for me. Thok finished bandaging her leg and sat back on his heels. Do you know why I really joined that supply convoy? Lyralii shook her head. Because no one else would have me, he admitted. The Warsong clan tolerates me because I'm still useful in battle, but no one trusts me with important missions. Escorting supplies through safe territory, that's what they give to warriors who can't be trusted with anything else. But you fought so bravely. I fought desperately, Thok corrected. Like a warrior with nothing left to lose. Because that's what I am. He looked out over the marsh. My grandmother used to say that the spirits test us not with our successes, but with our failures. The measure of a warrior isn't whether they fall, but whether they choose to rise again. And have you chosen to rise? Thok considered this. I thought I had. But maybe I was just going through the motions, hoping that enough small victories would erase one large failure. He looked at her directly. What about you? Will you rise? Lyralii wiped her eyes and tested her newly bandaged leg. The pain was already subsiding. I don't know. I want to, but I'm not sure I know how. Then perhaps we can figure it out together, Thok suggested. Two failures supporting each other might be stronger than one success. Lyralii nodded, her moment of vulnerability already hardening back into determination. How far to Brackenwall? If we push hard and avoid the main roads, we can make it by tomorrow evening, Thok replied. But we'll need to be careful. They're tracking us now. As they began their descent from the hill, Lyralii caught Thok's arm. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for the healing, but for listening. Thank you for saving me, he replied. And for giving me something worth protecting again. The baying of the hounds grew closer, and they picked up their pace. Behind them, the hunt continued, but ahead lay the promise of safety and perhaps, just perhaps, redemption. Chapter 5, The Hunters Become the Hunted. The Alliance tracking party had been following them for most of the day, their hounds picking up the scent trail despite Thok and Lyralii's best efforts to mask their passage. As evening approached, the two fugitives found themselves pressed against a cliff face overlooking a narrow canyon, the sounds of their pursuers growing ever closer. 8 soldiers, 2 handlers, and at least 4 hounds, Thok reported, peering through the sparse vegetation that concealed their position. They're well-equipped and experienced. Lyralii crouched beside him, her face pale with exhaustion. The forced march had taken its toll on both of them, but especially on her still healing leg. Can we fight them? Not in my condition, and not with you barely able to walk, Thok replied grimly. We need another option. There, Lyralii pointed to a series of rock formations across the canyon. If we can reach those caves, we might be able to lose them in the tunnels. Thok studied the terrain. The canyon was perhaps 50 feet wide, with steep walls on both sides. A stream ran along the bottom, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far wall near the cave entrance. It's a difficult climb, especially for someone with a wounded leg. I'll manage, Lyralii said with more confidence than she felt. No, Thok shook his head. There's a better way. But you won't like it. Before Lyralii could ask what he meant, the sound of barking grew much closer. They could hear voices now, speaking in common. Trails fresh here, sir. Can't be more than an hour ahead. Good. We'll have them before nightfall. The reward for that orc's head will buy us all around at the tavern. Thok's jaw tightened. They're not just tracking us. They're hunting us for sport. What's your plan? Lyralii whispered. I'm going to lead them away from here, Thok said, checking his axe. Give you time to reach the caves. That's suicide, Lyralii protested. You're still healing, and they outnumber you 4-1. Better one of us survives than neither, Thok replied. Besides, I'm tired of running. It's time to face this with honor. Honor? Lyralii's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. You think dying pointlessly is honorable? I think protecting someone who saved my life is honorable, Thok countered. You have skills that could help many people. I'm just another failed warrior. You're not, Lyralii began, but Thok cut her off. The decision is made, he said firmly. When I engage them, you run. Don't look back. But as Thok prepared to leave their hiding spot, Lyralii grabbed his arm. Wait. I have a better idea. Lyralii. Just listen, she insisted. You're right that we can't fight them directly. But what if we didn't have to? She pointed to the waterfall across the canyon. The rock face near the falls looks unstable. If we could cause a rock slide. Thok followed her gaze, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. It would block the canyon, force them to find another route. But how do we trigger it from here? Leave that to me, Lyralii said, her eyes beginning to glow with magical energy. I still have enough mana for one significant spell. You said your reserves were nearly empty. They are. This will drain me completely, probably leave me unconscious for hours. But it might work. She looked at him seriously. Are you willing to trust me? Thok hesitated. Everything in his warrior's training told him to face enemies directly, with blade and strength. But he'd seen what Lyralii could do with her magic, and more importantly, he'd come to trust her judgment. What do you need me to do? Keep them busy for about 2 minutes, she said, already beginning to weave complex magical patterns in the air. I need to concentrate, and I need a clear line of sight to the cliff face. 2 minutes, Thok nodded. I can do that. The sounds of the hunting party were very close now. Thok could hear individual voices, the panting of dogs, the clink of armor and weapons. He gripped his axe tighter, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon in his hands. Thok, Lyralii called softly. Whatever happens, know that I'm proud to call you friend. And I you, he replied. Now let's show these alliance dogs what happens when they hunt the horde. With a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls, Thok emerged from their hiding place and charged toward the approaching soldiers. Behind him, he could hear Lyralii beginning her incantation, her voice rising in the ancient tongue of the Sindorii. The hunt was about to become very interesting indeed. Chapter 6, Magic and Steel. Thok's war cry split the evening air as he crashed through the underbrush, his great axe gleaming in the fading light. The Alliance soldiers, caught off guard by his sudden appearance, scrambled to form a defensive line. But Thok wasn't charging to engage them, he was charging to scatter them, to break their formation and buy Lyralii the time she needed. There. The orc. Captain Harwick shouted, raising his sword. Spread out. Don't let him escape. Thok barreled into the center of their formation like a runaway boulder, his axe carving a deadly arc through the air. One soldier fell immediately, his shield split clean in two. Another stumbled backward, barely avoiding the return swing that would have taken his head. Behind him, Lyralii's voice rose in pitch, her spell building to its crescendo. Thok could feel the magical energy building in the air, making his skin tingle and his hair stand on end. The soldiers seemed to sense it too, their movements becoming more frantic. "Mage," one of them shouted. "There's a mage in the rocks. Find her." Harwick commanded, even as he parried a crushing blow from Thok's axe. "Take her down." Two soldiers broke away from the main group, heading toward Lyraliai's position. Thok snarled and shifted his attack, intercepting them with a sweeping charge that sent both men tumbling. But the effort cost him. A crossbow bolt from one of the flanking soldiers caught him in the shoulder, and he felt his freshly healed wounds protest the strain. "Loktar," he roared, using the pain to fuel his rage. "Victory or death." The magical energy in the air reached a crescendo, and Lyraliai's voice rose to a shout. Ancient words of power echoed off the canyon walls, and suddenly the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Thok felt the spell building. Then it was released. A lance of pure magical force, brilliant as the sun and hot as dragon fire, streaked across the canyon and struck the cliff face near the waterfall. The impact was tremendous, rock shattered, steam exploded from the waterfall, and the entire canyon wall shuddered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a rumble like distant thunder, the cliff began to collapse. "Run!" Thok bellowed, grabbing the nearest Alliance soldier by the throat and hurling him toward the canyon mouth. "The whole wall's coming down." The soldiers didn't need to be told twice. As massive boulders began to crash down into the canyon, both Horde and Alliance fighters scattered for safety. Thok fought his way through the chaos, desperate to reach Lyraliai before the rockslide could claim her. He found her collapsed against a boulder, her face pale and her breathing shallow. The spell had drained her completely, just as she'd predicted. But she was alive, and more importantly, she was smiling. Did it work?" she whispered. Thok looked back at the canyon. Where once there had been a clear passage, now there was only a wall of broken stone and debris. The waterfall had been completely diverted, and the Alliance soldiers were trapped on the far side. "It worked," he confirmed, scooping her up in his arms. "But we need to move. They'll find another way around eventually." Can't walk," Lyraliai mumbled, her eyes fluttering closed. "No mana left." "Then I'll carry you," Thok said simply. Partners don't leave partners behind. As he began to walk away from the blocked canyon, Lyraliai stirred in his arms. "Thok." "Yes." "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen," she said softly. "The way you fought, you weren't just trying to win. You were trying to protect me." "Of course I was," Thok replied. "That's what warriors do. We protect those who cannot protect themselves." "Is that what honor means to you?" "Protection." Thok considered this as he picked his way through the darkening marsh. "I used to think honor meant glory in battle, conquest, proving my strength to others. But maybe it means something different." "What?" "Maybe it means being willing to sacrifice for others. Being something worth believing in." He looked down at her. "You taught me that." Lyraliai smiled, her eyes closing as exhaustion finally claimed her. "Good," she murmured. "Because you taught me something too." "What's that?" "That magic isn't just about power. It's about purpose. And sometimes the most powerful magic is the trust between friends." As night fell over Dustwallow Marsh, an unlikely pair continued their journey toward safety. Behind them, the blocked canyon stood as a monument to what they had accomplished together. Ahead lay Brackenwall Village, and perhaps, the chance for both of them to find the redemption they sought. But first, they had to survive the night. And in the darkness that surrounded them, new dangers were already beginning to stir. Chapter 7, The Scent of Smoke. Thok had been carrying Lyraliai for 3 hours when he first smelled the smoke. Not the acrid smoke of battle, but something else, wood smoke, cooking fires, and underneath it all, the unmistakable scent of fear. He stopped in his tracks, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. "What is it?" Lyralii asked groggily. The blood elf had been drifting in and out of consciousness since her magical collapse, but she was alert enough now to sense his tension. "Smoke," Thok replied, gently setting her down behind a cluster of marsh grass. "From the northeast. But something's wrong about it." Lyralii struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on a gnarled staff she'd fashioned from a fallen branch. Her magical reserves were still depleted, leaving her feeling hollow and weak, but her mind was clear. "How can you tell?" "The wind," Thok explained, his scarred face grim. "It's carrying more than just smoke. There's blood in the air, and something else." He paused, his expression darkening. Desperation. They crept forward through the marsh, moving as quietly as possible despite Lyralii's condition. As they drew closer to the source of the smoke, they could hear voices, some shouting orders in common, others crying out in Orcish and Torahi. "Prisoners," Thok whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his axe. "Alliance forces have captured Horde soldiers." They reached the edge of a small clearing where the true scope of the situation became clear. A temporary Alliance camp had been established around what appeared to be a supply depot. Wooden cages held nearly 24 Horde prisoners, orcs, Tauren, and even a few trolls. The captives were in poor condition, many bearing wounds that hadn't been properly treated. "By the sun well," Lyralii breathed, her healer's instincts immediately cataloging the injuries she could see. "They're not treating them as prisoners of war. They're treating them as animals." Thok's jaw clenched as he watched an Alliance soldier kick one of the cages when a young orc inside asked for water. "Worse than animals," he growled. "Even beasts deserve basic dignity." "How many guards?" Lyralii asked, forcing herself to think tactically despite her horror. 15, maybe 20, Thok replied, studying the camp layout. "Well armed, organized. They're planning to move the prisoners at dawn, probably to Theramore for interrogation." "We have to do something," Lyralii said immediately. "We?" Thok looked at her incredulously. "You can barely stand, let alone fight. And I'm still healing from my own wounds." "Those are our people in there," Lyralii insisted. "I may not be an orc or a Tauren, but I'm Horde. We don't abandon our own." Thok studied her face in the dim moonlight. Despite her exhaustion, despite the magical drain that had left her hollow, there was steel in her emerald eyes. "It would be suicide," he said quietly. "Even if we could free them, we'd never escape. The Alliance would hunt us down within hours." "Then we make sure they can't," Lyralii replied. "The supply depot, if we could destroy it, create enough chaos and confusion. The prisoners would be caught in the crossfire," Thok pointed out. "We'd be as likely to kill them as save them." "Not if we do it right," Lyralii said, her mind already working through the possibilities. "What if we could disable the guards first? Create a distraction that draws them away from the prisoners?" Thok considered this, his warrior's mind evaluating the tactical situation. "The guards change shifts at midnight. For about 10 minutes, there will be fewer eyes on the prisoner cages." "That's not much time," Lyralii observed. "No," Thok agreed. "But it might be enough. If we could free the prisoners and get them to the marshes, they'd have a chance. The Alliance wouldn't be able to track them effectively in the dark." "What about us?" Lyralii asked. Thok was quiet for a long moment. "We probably wouldn't make it out," he said finally. "But those prisoners definitely won't survive interrogation at Theramore. At least this way, they have a chance." "Then we do it," Lyralii said without hesitation. "But we do it smart. I may not have recovered much of my mana, but I have enough for a few low-level spells. Something that could help even the odds." "What kind of spells?" "Sleep magic," Lyralii explained. "If I can get close enough to the guard posts, I can put several of them under at once. It won't last long, but it might give us the opening we need. Thok nodded slowly. And while you're doing that, I'll approach the cages from the other side. Free as many prisoners as I can before the spell wears off. It's a long shot, Lyralei admitted. The best plans usually are, Thok replied. He looked at her seriously. Are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. We'll be committed. Lyralei thought of her father, of his disappointment in her choices. Of the expectations she'd failed to meet and the path she'd chosen instead. I've spent my whole life trying to prove I was worthy of being Sindorii, she said quietly. Maybe it's time I proved I was worthy of being Horde. And I've spent years trying to atone for past failures, Thok added. Perhaps this is the chance I've been waiting for. They spent the next hour planning, watching the guard rotations, and preparing for what might be their final battle. As midnight approached, both warriors felt the weight of their decision. They were about to risk everything for people they'd never met, with no guarantee of success. Thok, Lyralei said as they prepared to move into position. If we don't make it out of this. We will, Thok interrupted. We've come too far to fail now. But if we don't, she pressed on, I want you to know that these have been the best days of my life. For the first time, I felt like I was making a difference. Like I was more than just a disappointment. You were never a disappointment, Thok said firmly. You're the bravest person I've ever met. Your father would be proud of you. And you're not the failure you think you are, Lyralei replied. You're a true warrior. Not because you can swing an axe, but because you're willing to sacrifice everything for others. They clasped hands briefly, two unlikely allies about to attempt the impossible. Then, as the moon reached its zenith, they separated and began moving toward their positions. The rescue was about to begin. Chapter 8, The Rescue. The Alliance camp was quieter now, most of the soldiers either asleep or focused on their card games around the main fire. Lyralei crept through the shadows at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it would give her away. Her magical reserves were dangerously low, but she had to make this work. Lives depended on it. She could see Thok's massive form moving like a ghost through the marsh grass on the opposite side of the camp. For such a large warrior, he moved with surprising stealth, his years of experience evident in every careful step. The plan was simple in theory. She would put the guards to sleep, he would free the prisoners, and they would all escape into the marsh together. In practice, Lyralei knew, it would be chaos. She reached the first guard post, where two human soldiers sat talking in low voices. One was cleaning his sword while the other kept watch over the prisoner cages. Lyralei closed her eyes and began to weave the spell, drawing on the last dregs of her magical energy. Dorano Ethela. Thiroshan. She whispered in Thalassian, the ancient words of a sleep enchantment her tutors had taught her years ago. The magic flowed out of her like water from a broken dam, and she felt her strength drain away even further. The first guard's eyes began to droop. His companion noticed and started to speak, but then his own eyelids grew heavy. Within moments, both men were slumped over, snoring softly. Lyralei moved to the next position, where 3 more guards were stationed. The spell was harder to cast this time, her magical reserves nearly exhausted. But she managed it, watching as the soldiers succumbed to magical slumber one by one. Across the camp, she could see Thok had reached the prisoner cages. He was working quickly and quietly, using his axe to break the locks on the wooden cells. The first cage opened, and a massive Tauran warrior emerged, followed by 2 orcs who looked like they could barely stand. Quickly, Thok whispered in Orcish to the freed prisoners. To the marsh. Stay low and quiet. The prisoners needed no further encouragement. They began moving toward the edge of the camp, helping their wounded comrades as best they could. Thok continued working on the locks, his axe blade making quick work of the crude wood and iron. But as Lyralei approached the final guard post, disaster struck. One of the sleeping soldiers at the first position began to stir, the sleep spell wearing off faster than expected. He blinked, saw the empty cages, and immediately began shouting. Escape! The prisoners are escaping! The camp erupted into chaos. Soldiers poured out of tents, grabbing weapons and shouting orders. Lyralii abandoned stealth and ran toward the cages, determined to help free the remaining prisoners before the Alliance could reorganize. Thok, she called out, but her voice was lost in the commotion. The orc warrior had freed nearly half the prisoners, but there were still a dozen trapped in the remaining cages. He looked up as crossbow bolts beat. Form up, an Alliance captain shouted. Don't let them reach the marsh. Thok made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He could continue trying to free the remaining prisoners and likely get everyone killed, or he could ensure that those already freed made it to safety. The warrior in him wanted to stay and fight, but the leader in him knew what had to be done. Go, he roared to the freed prisoners. I'll hold them off. What about the others? One of the orcs called back. Go. Thok repeated, raising his axe as Alliance soldiers charged toward him. Lyralii reached the cages just as the first wave of soldiers arrived. She had no mana left for spells, but she still had her staff and the fighting skills all blood elves learned in their youth. She swung the makeshift weapon with desperate strength, catching one soldier in the temple and dropping him to the ground. The keys, she shouted to Thok. Where are the keys to the locks? Captain's tent. Thok replied, parrying a sword thrust with his axe handle. But there's no time. There's always time, Lyralii snarled, and suddenly she was moving with a speed and grace that surprised even herself. She ducked under a crossbow bolt, spun around a charging soldier, and sprinted toward the command tent. Inside, she found what she was looking for, a ring of keys hanging from a wooden post. But as she grabbed them, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see an Alliance sergeant entering the tent, his sword drawn. Nowhere to run, elf, he said with a cruel smile. You're going to die here. Maybe, Lyralii replied, hefting her staff. But not alone. The fight was brief but vicious. The sergeant was wounded, but Lyralii fought with the desperation of someone who knew that failure meant death for the prisoners still trapped in the cages. She managed to land a solid blow to his sword arm, disarming him, then followed up with a strike to his head that left him unconscious. She raced back to the cages, keys in hand, just as Thok was beginning to be overwhelmed by the sheer number of Alliance soldiers. The orc was bleeding from multiple wounds, his movements slower than before. Catch! Lyralii shouted, tossing him the keys. Thok caught them with his free hand and immediately began unlocking the remaining cages. The prisoners poured out, some grabbing weapons from fallen guards, others simply running toward the marsh where their comrades waited. Time to go. Thok called to Lyralii as the last prisoner was freed. But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked by a line of Alliance soldiers with crossbows trained on them. Behind the soldiers stood Captain Blackwood, his face twisted with rage. You're not going anywhere, he snarled. You've cost us valuable prisoners and good soldiers. Now you're going to pay. Lyralii and Thok stood back to back, surrounded and outnumbered. The freed prisoners were safely away, but their own escape seemed impossible. Any last words? Blackwood asked, raising his hand to signal his men to fire. Yes, Thok said, his voice carrying across the camp. For the Horde. For the Horde. Lyralii echoed, raising her staff. It was then that the real rescue began. Chapter 9, Heroes Born. The war cry that erupted from the marsh was unlike anything Lyralii had ever heard. It was the sound of 20 freed prisoners who had decided that abandoning their rescuers was not an option. The massive Tauran warrior who had been in the first cage led the charge, his hooves thundering across the ground as he wielded a fallen guard's sword like a club. Loktar Ogre, the Tauran bellowed, his voice shaking the very air. Victory or death. The Alliance soldiers spun around in confusion as the freed prisoners smashed into their ranks from behind. What had seemed like a certain execution for Thok and Lyralii suddenly became a chaotic melee with no clear lines of battle. Impossible! Captain Blackwood shouted, trying to maintain control of the situation. They escaped. How did they? His words were cut off as an orc warrior's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. The prisoner, who bore the ritual scars of the Frostwolf clan, grinned fiercely at Thok. "Did you think we would abandon those who freed us?" he asked in Orcish. "We are Horde. We do not leave our own behind." Thok felt something swell in his chest: pride, hope, redemption. These warriors had risked recapture to save him and Lyralii. They had chosen honor over safety, just as he and Lyralii had chosen to attempt the rescue in the first place. "Form a circle," Thok commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a natural leader. "Protect the most wounded and fight your way to the marsh." The Horde prisoners responded immediately, their discipline evident despite their ordeal. They formed a protective ring around their most injured comrades, with Thok and Lyralii at the center. The Alliance soldiers, caught between the escaped prisoners and the camp, struggled to mount an effective counterattack. "This is incredible," Lyralii breathed, watching as the Tauren warrior literally picked up an Alliance soldier and threw him into a supply wagon. "They came back for us." "They came back for what we represent," Thok corrected, parrying a sword thrust from a desperate human soldier. "Hope." The idea that Horde means something more than just an alliance of convenience. The fighting was fierce but brief. The Alliance soldiers, demoralized by the sudden reversal of fortune and outnumbered by the determined prisoners, began to break ranks. Some fled into the marsh, while others surrendered rather than face the righteous fury of the escaped captives. Captain Blackwood, blood streaming from his broken nose, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He raised a crossbow and aimed it directly at Lyralii's back as she helped a wounded troll to his feet. "If I can't have prisoners," he snarled, "at least I can have revenge." But Thok had seen the movement. Without thinking, without hesitation, he threw himself between Lyralii and the crossbow bolt. The iron tip took him high in the chest, punching through his mail and into his lung. He staggered but remained standing, his axe still ready. "Thok!" Lyralii screamed, spinning around to see him swaying on his feet, blood frothing at his lips. "I'm fine," he gasped, though clearly he was anything but. Just finish this." Harwick was reloading his crossbow when the Tauren warrior's massive hand closed around his throat. The Alliance captain's eyes bulged as he was lifted off his feet. "You dare attack those who showed mercy?" The Tauren rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "You have no honor, human. No right to wear a warrior's uniform." "Please," Blackwood choked out. "I surrender. I surrender." The Tauren looked to Thok, who was now being supported by Lyralii. Despite his wounds, the orc warrior's eyes were clear and determined. "Let him go," Thok said quietly. "We are not butchers. We are better than that." The Tauren hesitated, then released his grip. Blackwood collapsed to the ground, gasping and clutching his throat. You're all monsters," he wheezed. "No," Lyralii said, her voice filled with quiet dignity. "We're Horde. And that means something." The rescued prisoners quickly finished securing the camp, gathering weapons and supplies for the journey ahead. Several of them had medical training and helped Lyralii tend to the wounded, including Thok's newest injury. "The bolt missed your heart," she reported, her healing magic working to close the wound. "But you've lost a lot of blood. You need rest." "No time," Thok replied, though his voice was weak. "We need to reach Brackenwall before dawn. The Alliance will send reinforcements." The Tauren warrior, who had introduced himself as Corvin Thunderhoof, approached them with a proposal. "Brother Thok, Sister Lyralii," he said formally. "You have given us our freedom, our lives. We would be honored to escort you to safety. We can't ask you to do that, Lyralii protested. You have your own lives to return to, your own families to find. And how do you think we will face them? Asked the Frostwolf Orc. How do we tell our children that we abandoned the heroes who saved us? That we chose the easy path over the honorable one? Thok looked around at the circle of faces, orcs, tauren, trolls, all of them marked by captivity but not broken by it. In their eyes, he saw something he had thought lost forever, respect. Not fear, not pity, but genuine respect for what he and Lyralii had accomplished. Then we travel together, he said simply. As Horde. As family. The march to Brackenwall village took the rest of the night, but it was unlike any journey Thok had ever experienced. Instead of the solitary burden of command he had carried for so long, he found himself sharing leadership with Corvin and the other senior warriors. Instead of the isolation of past failures, he was surrounded by comrades who valued his judgment and trusted his decisions. And beside him, every step of the way, walked Lyralii. The Blood Elf healer had found her own redemption in the rescue, proving to herself and others that her worth wasn't measured by her father's expectations or her magical power, but by her willingness to sacrifice for others. As the sun rose over Dustwallow Marsh, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the group created a hill and saw their destination spread out below them. Brackenwall Village, with its sturdy walls and Horde banners flying proudly in the morning breeze. We made it, Lyralii said, hardly believing it herself. No, Thok replied, his arm around her shoulders for support. We made something better. We made a difference. Behind them, 20 freed prisoners walked with renewed purpose, carrying with them a story that would be told in taverns and around campfires for years to come. The story of an orc warrior who found his honor not in conquest but in compassion, and a blood elf healer who discovered that the greatest magic was the courage to stand up for what was right. They had begun their journey as outcasts and failures. They were ending it as heroes. Chapter 10, New Beginnings. 3 months had passed since the rescue at the Alliance camp, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of Brackenwall village. Thok watched with satisfaction as a mixed group of young Horde warriors, orcs, tauren, trolls, and blood elves, practiced the coordinated fighting techniques he had been teaching them. Remember, he called out to a young blood elf who was struggling with his shield work, your strength doesn't come from your muscles alone. It comes from trusting the warrior beside you. The elf nodded and adjusted his stance, working in closer coordination with his tauren partner. Thok smiled, remembering his own struggles to learn that same lesson. You're a natural teacher, Lyralii observed, approaching from the medical tent where she had been tending to training injuries. Her robes were now a mixture of Sindorii silk and practical leather, marking her as both healer and warrior. Who would have thought that the fearsome Thok Bloodfist would find his calling in education? Not education, Thok corrected, lowering his voice so the trainees couldn't hear. Redemption. For all of us. The success of their rescue mission had spread throughout the Horde territories, earning them both recognition and new responsibilities. Warchief Thrall himself had summoned them to Orgrimmar, where they had been asked to establish a new training program, one that would prepare mixed units of Horde warriors to work together regardless of their racial backgrounds. Speaking of redemption, Lyralii said, pulling a letter from her pouch, this arrived by Wyvern this morning. It's from Silvermoon. Thok saw the mix of hope and apprehension in her eyes. Your father? Yes. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the contents. As she did, her expression shifted from nervousness to surprise to something approaching joy. He wants to see me. He says he's heard stories about what we did, about the prisoners we saved. He's proud of me. Of course he is, Thok said warmly. Any father would be proud to have such a daughter. He's invited both of us to Silvermoon, Lyralii continued, her voice growing stronger. He wants to meet the warrior who helped me find my path. Both of us? Thok raised an eyebrow. A scarred orc warrior in the crystal spires of Silvermoon City. That should be interesting. You'll come? Lyralii asked, and Thok could hear the hope in her voice. Of course, he replied. Partners don't abandon partners, remember? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Corvin Thunderhoof, who had chosen to remain at Brackenwall as an instructor rather than return to his own tribe. The massive Tauren carried himself with the quiet dignity that had made him a natural leader among the rescued prisoners. Brother Thok, Sister Lyralii, he said formally, we have visitors. Following his gesture, they saw a group of riders approaching the village gates. Leading them was a figure Thok recognized immediately, Grak, the young orc warrior who had served under him during the disastrous supply mission that had started this entire adventure. Grak! Thok called out, striding forward to meet his former subordinate. What brings you to Brackenwall? The young orc dismounted and approached with obvious nervousness. Commander Thok, he said formally, I bring word from the Warsong clan. War Chief Grom Hellscream himself has heard of your deeds. He wishes to offer you a position as a war leader, with your own clan to command. Thok felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the old hunger for glory, for recognition, for the chance to prove himself in the traditional way. But as he looked around at the training grounds, at the mixed group of warriors who had learned to trust each other, at Lyralii standing beside him with quiet confidence, he realized that he had already found what he was looking for. Tell the war chief that I am honored by his offer, Thok said slowly. But my place is here, training the next generation of Horde warriors. This is where I can do the most good. Grak's eyes widened in surprise. But this is everything you've wanted. A chance to redeem yourself, to lead again. I have redeemed myself, Thok replied simply. And I am leading. Just not in the way I once thought I wanted to. Besides, Lyralii added with a slight smile, someone needs to keep this old warrior out of trouble. The son well knows he can't manage it on his own. Grak looked confused, clearly not understanding the easy familiarity between an orc warrior and a blood elf healer. But Corvin nodded approvingly, and several of the trainees had gathered close enough to hear the exchange. Will you stay for the evening meal? Thok asked Grak. I'd like to show you what we're building here. That evening, the great hall of Brackenwall village was filled with laughter and conversation as warriors of all races shared food and stories. Thok found himself at the center of it all, no longer the isolated commander trying to prove himself, but a respected teacher and mentor. You know, Lyralii said quietly, sitting beside him at the head table, I never thanked you properly. For what? For saving me. Not just from the Alliance, but from myself. Before I met you, I was so focused on trying to be what others wanted me to be that I forgot who I actually was. And who are you? Thok asked with genuine curiosity. I'm a healer, Lyralii said simply. Not because my magic is powerful, but because I care about people. I'm a blood elf who chose to serve the Horde not out of convenience, but out of conviction. And I'm a warrior who fights with compassion instead of just strength. Those are good things to be, Thok observed. What about you? Who are you now? Thok considered the question, looking out over the mixed gathering of warriors who had become his extended family. I'm a teacher, he said finally. A protector. Someone who understands that true strength comes not from what you can destroy, but from what you can build. And I'm a friend, he added, looking at her directly. The best friend I've ever had. Lyralii smiled, raising her mug of ale. To friendship, then. And to second chances. To friendship, Thok agreed, clinking his mug against hers. And to the understanding that redemption isn't a destination, it's a journey. Outside the great hall, the night air was cool and clear. The stars shone down on Dustwallow Marsh, illuminating the path that had brought two unlikely allies together and transformed them both. In the distance, the lights of other Horde settlements twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing lives that had been touched by the story of an orc warrior and a blood elf healer who had learned that true honor came not from individual glory, but from the courage to stand together. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and possibilities. There would be new students to train, new missions to undertake, new ways to serve the Horde and protect the innocent. But whatever came, they would face it together. Partners, friends, and living proof that even the most unlikely bonds could forge the strongest alliances. As the celebration continued into the night, Thok and Lyralii stepped outside to look up at the stars. The marsh that had once seemed like a prison now felt like home, and the path that had begun with blood and desperation had led them to something far more precious than either had dared to hope for. They had found their redemption. They had found their purpose. Most importantly, they had found each other. The story was far from over, but this chapter, the chapter of doubt and isolation and failure, was finally closed. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference in the world. But tonight, they were simply two friends standing under the stars, grateful for the journey that had brought them together and excited for the road that lay ahead. For the Horde. For honor. For friendship.